Instead of using my last week of summer vacation to prepare for my final year in college, I decided to prepare for the new Yakuza games coming out in November and in January. But how would I do that exactly, you might ask? Well, just read the title. I thought that it would be a great idea to revisit and finish each game from one of my favorite video game franchises, so I can have a better understanding of what the games have done and improved on over the years, and to just revisit Kiryu's story in general. But well, there's a bit of a problem. If you've played any of these games casually, then you know how long it takes just to beat one game. And if you look at howlongtobeat.com, you can see that each game takes like 20 hours to beat, and with 19 games in the Yakuza franchise, how the hell am I going to pull this off? Well, since these games are quite story and cutscene driven, a lot of the time in these casual playthroughs can be cut just by skipping all the cutscenes. Yakuza games also have a ton of side content, which everybody does at least some of, so by minimizing all of that, I should be able to get through these games quite quickly. Before we get into this challenge, I just want to mention one thing. You may have noticed a little asterisk in the title. I'm going to be playing every Yakuza game that's available on Steam. I don't have a capture card for the PS3, so I'm going to be skipping out on the original Yakuza 1 and 2, Kenzan, Dead Souls, and Ishin, along with the PSP games and Fist of the North Star. So why not just emulate these games? I'll be going through the games in canonical order. So first up we have Yakuza 0. If you played any of the Yakuza games, then this is probably the one, or have at least heard about this game from the countless Baka Mitai AI covers. People started to look behind the memes and realize that there's actually a very good game here. We get introduced to a young Kiryu Kazuma, doing a debt collection job for a loan shark. After finishing his job and getting the bag, he meets up with his best friend Nishikiyama. During their night out, Kiryu finds out that the person he collected money from was found dead, and that he was being framed for it. And that's the basis of the story, at least on Kiryu's side. There's another protagonist you can play as named Majima. Majima was exiled from the Yakuza due to an assassination committed by his sworn brother, and now runs a cabaret club Grand as his punishment. Under constant surveillance by the Yakuza, he knows that he can't escape and is falling into despair, but an opportunity arises for him. If he can assassinate a person named Makoto Makimura, he'll be able to rejoin the Tojo clan. While doing research for his target, he finds out that Makoto is actually a blind woman. Majima isn't able to kill her, and he decides that he will try to save her instead. The game alternates between their two stories every 2 chapters, leaving you wondering what is going to happen to Kiryu or Majima, without feeling like the story is dragging on. For the most part. The beginning chapters can feel a bit long though, especially with Kiryu, since he has to go all around Kamurocho to buy different brands of alcohol for the homeless. Speaking of Kamurocho, that's a city where Kiryu's story takes place, while Majima's takes place in another city called Sotenbori. Kiryu and Majima have 3 fighting stances which they can choose from at the beginning, each with their own pros and cons. Kiryu has the Brawler, Rush, and Beast classes. Without going into too much detail, the Brawler class is like your average fighting class, Rush is fast compared to Brawler, but does much less damage, and Beast class is very powerful, but it can be quite slow to move around in. Majima has the Thug, Breaker, and Slugger classes. The Thug and Brawler classes are similar to each other, but the main differences between Kiryu and Majima are between the other two. The Breaker class uses the power of breakdancing to defeat your enemies, and the Slugger class uses baseball bats. Underneath the health bar you have 3 separate bars, which is your heat. You can increase your heat by fighting, and depending how many bars you have filled up, you can do different actions. For example, we have access to a special move when we are on 2 heat bars, but we can't use it if we only have 1 or have 3. Your attack speed is also based on your heat level, with your attacks getting faster when your heat bars are full. You can also do heat moves when a little symbol appears towards the top of the screen, showing that you can perform a heat action, and depending on the environment or weapon you're holding, you can get different ones, varying in damage. The upgrading system is also quite unique compared to any other Yakuza games. Instead of getting experience from fighting enemies, you get extra money, which is then used to upgrade your stats and unlock new moves. It also adds a bit more complexity to the game, because you have to manage your funds by buying gear and weapons, or if you want to improve your stats. I like the system a lot, and it also ties in quite nicely with the time frame this game takes place in, which is during the Japanese economy bubble in 1988. Like, when you fight enemies, you can literally see money fly everywhere. I always believed that Yakuza 0 was one of the best games in the entire franchise, and after revisiting it, I still agree with this statement. I haven't been invested in the game's story as much as Yakuza 0's ever since I played it for the first time around 2 years ago. Because I decided to beat each game in a single week, I didn't really have time to do any of the extra side content, meaning that I'm missing out on one of the best parts of Yakuza 0. Instead of doing a tier list based on the game's quality, I'll instead be ranking the main menus for each game. Yakuza 0's main menu is fairly solid. The background has an empty parking lot, which is an important plot point for the game, with Kiryu's back tattoo being on the left hand side. Loading into the main menu doesn't take a lot of time and you can just get into the game straight away. While the song isn't anything crazy, it does set the mood for the game, and in a way, it tells you what to expect from the game. I'll put Yakuza 0's main menu in the B tier. I was going to do Yakuza Kiwami on day 1 as well, but Yakuza 0 decided to crash around 2 hours into my playthrough. And with no autosave in this game, it meant that I had to start from the very beginning, so I decided to leave Kiwami for day 2. Yakuza Kiwami is a recreation of the original game that came out on the PlayStation 2 in 2005, but it feels more like a Yakuza 0.5 to me. Kiryu is the only playable protagonist here, cutting the playable styles by half. The combat is also pretty much the same as Yakuza 0, but the settings and abilities have been tweaked to make them a bit more balanced and enjoyable. But while the combat itself is more enjoyable, I think that the fights are a lot worse because of this one simple addition that doctors hate: extreme heat. When bosses are low on health, they can regenerate it by using their extreme heat. But there is a way to cancel their healing. Depending on the color of their aura, you have to swap to a style with the matching color, and do a Kiwami hit move to cancel their heal. Unfortunately though, you have to unlock the Kiwami heat moves on the skill tree, and you won't be able to unlock them in the early game. Not only that, but each fighting style has their own Kiwami heat move, meaning that you can have it for the Brawler and Beast class, but if the boss has a Dragon or Rush aura, then you're just forced to watch him heal, and there's nothing you can do about it. The bosses in the game are ripped directly from the original, meaning that they can be a bit unbalanced and take a long time to defeat. And with this new Kiwami heat move addition, it just makes those fights last much longer. I've heard horror stories about how people have spent up to 20 to 30 minutes just fighting a single boss in this game. The story starts 6 years after Yakuza 0, in 1994. Nishiki ends up killing an important Yakuza member to protect Yumi, a girl that he and Kiryu grew up with together. Kiryu decides to take the blame for it to save them. Kiryu spends 10 years in the joint, only to find out that Nishiki is now a bad guy, calling Kiryu mean names like a fucking pussy. Yumi goes missing during the time when Kiryu was in prison, and while searching for her, he runs into Haruka, who turns out to apparently be Yumi's niece. Because she has nowhere else to go, Kiryu decides to take her in for a while looking for their mother. Besides that, the game just kind of turns into a bunch of side quests in the middle, with the game returning to the main plot point towards the end. Majima everywhere was the main selling point for this game, at least for me anyway. Kiryu has lost his strength while in prison, and Majima promises to help him get back to his physical prime by stalking him and attacking him at random. It adds an extra layer of fear while in the overworld early on, since Majima has tons of health and is quite strong. But as you beat him more and more, you unlock more fighting styles for the dragon fighting stance, and by the end of the game, you are the one hunting him instead. In this playthrough though, he was really annoying. I beat this game in New Game Plus, meaning that I already had all the abilities and stuff, and if I did encounter him, I felt like I was just wasting my time, especially because of the large amount of health he has, taking 3 or 4 minutes just to beat him. In my experience, this game was the least fun to revisit in this whole challenge, and in general, I think that this is the least fun Yakuza game on Steam. And that's partially because of how good Yakuza 0 is. Kiwami is also one of the hardest games. This game is very faithful to the original PS2 game in terms of the fights, and they even reused the animations from the original game, which does explain why they can feel a bit stiff. They did add a few extra cutscenes, which explains Nishiki's time when Kiryu was in prison, showing us why he turned out the way he did, which is great, but the only way to fully appreciate them is if you've played Yakuza 0 beforehand. I don't know, this game just kind of exists. To me, it doesn't really feel like it serves any purpose, and it could have just been Yakuza 0 DLC or something, but without all the fetch quests in the middle of the game. Also, Kamurocho just feels a lot more jaded and dead. I know that the game is set after Japan's economic boom, but it's just way too dark in this game. I guess it doesn't help that the entire game was set during nighttime as well. This speedrun is also one of the most brutal speedruns I've ever attempted. I spent an hour trying just to beat Majima at the beginning, but I couldn't get myself to finish the fight, so I just switched to NG Plus instead. The main menu is a bit bleak, only showing Kiryu's back with his Dragon of Dojima tattoo fully colored, and surrounded by a black background. I don't really feel any inspiration coming from it, I'm just going to put it in C tier. This game left me deflated. Not only did it take me much longer than I thought it would just to beat it, but with the crash that happened in Yakuza 0, I was already about 5 hours behind my schedule, even though I'm barely into the second day. Only being 2 games in though, I knew that if I gave up on this challenge, it would live in my mind rent-free for the rest of the year. So I decided to push through it and I started Kiwami 2. Like the first Kiwami game, Yakuza Kiwami 2 is a remake of the second game, although this time it was created with the new Dragon engine, which was also used for Yakuza 6. I haven't really spoken about the release dates for each of the games, and it really isn't all that important in the grand scheme of things, with the exception being this game and 6. And that's because Kiwami 2 came out after 6. It feels like a Yakuza 6.5, but Kiwami 2 had a lot to improve from 6, and it delivered. Combat was improved a lot, and it didn't feel as heavy compared to 6, and it added a bunch of hit actions too. You could also equip weapons, which was something that you couldn't even do in 6. And Kamurocho is so much nicer to explore than in Kiwami. And since we're talking about Kamurocho, Sotenbori also makes a comeback in this game. In the original Yakuza 2, there was also a third area, Shinseicho, but since it wasn't really used much in the story, they decided to leave it out for this game. The story starts off with the leader, also known as the chairman of the Tojo clan, being murdered by the Omi Alliance, the rival Yakuza organization. The Omi want to start a war between them to take over the territory, and Kiryu is now tasked with preventing this war by finding a suitable replacement for the chairman. The Omi are aware of Kiryu's plans, and they aren't too happy about it. In particular, Ruji Goda, known as a Kansai dragon, wants to end Kiryu, as there can only be one dragon. You can also play as Majima in Majima's Saga. Majima's Saga is a small side story that takes around an hour or so to fully finish. The gist of it is that Majima gets sent out on a mission for the Tojo clan, and he has to return to Sotenbori for his research, stepping foot in the city for the first time in 18 years. He catches up and interacts with a few characters from Yakuza 0, closing out certain parts of his story from there. Unfortunately though, his gameplay took quite a huge hit. He only has one of the 4 fighting styles, and even then, it has been greatly restricted, with most of his heat moves being removed for the game. But for free side content, I find it hard to complain. A neat thing about Majima's Saga is that the enemies have set spawn points, rather than them roaming around in the streets. This game was quite short and an easy enough adventure, especially after having to play the first Kiwami game. That being said, I didn't really remember where to go most of the time, which resulted in me playing this game for a bit longer than I thought I would. Still though, 2.5 hours is quick. The main menu for the game is similar to Kiwami 1, but this time it plays many cinematic shots of Kiryu's Dragon of Dojima tattoo. Certainly more interesting to look at it for now. I'm going to put this into B tier. Also, I don't know where to mention this, so I'll just say it here. The direction of the stairs has changed between Yakuza 0 and Kiwami. I know it's been a few years, but even if they did replace the stairs, how the hell did they move the doors over? For many people, going from Kiwami 2 to 3 is jarring because of the huge drop in quality, but I actually really enjoyed playing through 3. It might be because I decided to remove the speedrun timer, but also because I remember this game being one of my favorite Yakuza games in general. One of my favorite things about this game is the story. It takes a very different approach from other Yakuza games, even to this day. Instead of starting the game in Kamurocho, we don't talk about the first chapter, the game begins with Kiryu running an orphanage in the remote islands of Okinawa. Kiryu has his own little safe space and it's just nice. After everything that he went through, he definitely deserves it. But with this being Yakuza and all, Kiryu just isn't allowed to have nice things. The gameplay on the other hand, well, it's certainly an early PS3 game. A lot of the people complain about the combat in this game, often calling it Yakuza 3 because, well, enemies love to block in this game. The bosses also have tons of health, making it drag on a bit too long if you're playing this from a fresh save file. And for the people that say that Yakuza 3 was designed with these difficulties in mind, and that you just can't handle it because you're shit and you just need to get good, to that, just use XXXYY, or square 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 triangle triangle, and that will solve all your problems. The first half of the game revolves around Kiryu's day-to-day life, or as some others would say, mandatory side quests for Kiryu's orphanage. Things like helping your kid get dressed, taking care of a scared dog, or putting a bully in their place by playing golf with a local governor. These do slow down the gameplay and the pace of the game quite a bit, but it's just something that I enjoy just because of how happy Kiryu feels. Yakuza 3 also introduces a lot of fan-favorite characters, like the main villain Mine and Rikiya, a younger brother figure for Kiryu. The second half of the game gets a little bit boring, with a bunch of government conspiracy stuff that I just don't really care for. The more I think about it, I realize that this is one of my favorites purely because this is one of the few games where we actually get to see Kiryu be happy, without really having to worry about how his past might affect the children at his orphanage. The main menu for this game, however, is one of the worst menus I've seen yet. It has nothing going on, and it takes like 3 seconds for you to actually use it. It's going at the bottom in D tier. Yakuza 4 was a big leap for the franchise, as it was the first game where you can play as someone that wasn't Kiryu. And not only that, there were 4 playable characters total, with the first one being Akiyama, a strong and elegant man who knows how to use his feet well. Saejima, who is Majima's sworn brother, is a strong tank that you have to charge up his moves for to do heavy damage. Tanimura, a quote-unquote corrupt cop that focuses more on countering and parrying his enemies. And of course Kiryu, who is, well, Kiryu. The story structure is different from Yakuza 0. Instead of alternating between chapters, you fully play through the character's story before switching to the next one. The different fighting styles bring in a good change of pace in a familiar area, with the game giving you enough time to experiment with the other fighting styles without it dragging out too much, except for Saejima, which I'll get into later. In general, each of the stories are separate from each other, with the only things in common being cameos from certain characters. After playing all 4 of their stories, they will team up together in the finale, where you get to swap between the 4 characters, leading to a boss rush, which includes the worst final boss in the Yakuza franchise. Yakuza 4's experience system is one of my favorites in this entire franchise though. When leveling up, you get 3 soul orbs, which you can then invest into any skill at any point. Every Yakuza game I've played up to this point has a skill tree system, which strips away a lot of the customization. The story structure kind of ruins it though, because by the time you unlocked most of the abilities, you'll have to switch to a new character that starts back at level 1. Saejima is one of my favorite characters to play as. Although he is bad against fast enemies, his charge-up attacks is one of the most satisfying things in the entire game for me. It's a shame that his story has one of the worst segments not only in Yakuza 4, but I'd even say in the entire Yakuza franchise. A prison break with an overpowered prison guard. Having to face Saito at such a low level, without the game giving you a chance to grind for a bit of experience, or to get fully stocked up on healing items. This is the one section where the experience lets the game down, unfortunately, if you don't know what you're doing. The final boss is also a mess. Tanimura was designed with parrying and countering in mind. So what do developers decide to do? Put him up against a group of highly trained police officers that can dodge his attacks easily. And if you're not careful, they will swarm you and take away most of your health. The double quick-step evade is also essential for this fight, because if you're far away from the main boss, he will shoot 2 bullets, knocking you down if you get hit. The bullets don't do that much damage, thankfully. They must be made out of rubber or something. Although Kamurocho was the only playable city in this game, they have expanded it a lot by adding the rooftops and underground sections, which you can use to avoid enemies roaming around in the streets. While I do think that they were a great idea, the execution of it left a lot to be desired. The rooftops felt very cluttered, and I would run into walls frequently, and I tried avoiding even going up to the roof whenever possible, as all the environments just look very similar to each other. It might be because I've played all the Yakuza games throughout the years, but when I'm in Kamurocho, I can tell exactly where I am for the most part. But for the rooftops, I had to check my maps every few seconds just to see where I was. For a game that improved and added so much content from the previous game, it's a shame that they haven't changed the main menu at all, like genuinely. The only thing that's different from this main menus in 3s is that they changed the numbers from 3 to 4. D tier. Yakuza 5, the game that pushed me into doing this challenge in the first place, purely because a legend run difficulty was the only thing that I needed to get 100% completion for this game. Yakuza 5 is easily the biggest game in the entire franchise in terms of length, taking me just under 10 hours to complete. It follows Yakuza 4's trend in that the game's title is the same as the amount of playable characters. You have Kiryu, Saejima, and Akiyama returning from the 4th game, with the new additions being Haruka, who was basically adopted by Kiryu after the events of Kiwami, and Shinada, a baseball player that was caught in a scandal and was forced to retire and is now a sex worker. What's different about this game is that each character has their own playable city, with the exception of being Haruka and Akiyama, both sharing Sotenbori. With Kiryu staying in Nagasugai, Saejima staying in prison, and then Tsukimino, and Shinada and Kinecho, they all meet up in Kamurocho for the finale. The story follows the exact same format as Yakuza 4, where you play through a character's entire story before moving on to the next. Each character also has their own developed side story, which include their very own unique minigames, like Kiryu's taxi driving, Saejima's hunting, Haruka's idol singing, and Shinada's baseball. With this game being on a different game engine than in 3 and 4, the combat does feel very different. Kiryu's combat is closer to what it is in Yakuza 0 and Kiwami. Akiyama feels the same as in Yakuza 4, except that he got nerfed drastically, making it a lot harder to actually combo and damage enemies, and Saejima stayed the same for the most part. Haruka's gameplay is a rhythm game, which you can just skip every battle for, funnily enough. But do be careful though, because if you skip a specific fight, then you won't be able to 100% the game. And then there's Shinada, whose fighting stance focuses on using weapons. Each character also has their own extreme heat mode, which gives them access to their own unique and special moves. You can charge up the extreme heat mode circle by using regular heat actions. I personally didn't really use these actions though, and I found them a bit annoying to use. There were plenty of other mechanics introduced in this game as well, only for them to be deleted and never used again. These also include meal bonuses, which give you a small boost to a certain stat depending on what you eat, and you could even double your health bar. A similar mechanic appears in the Judgment series, but it wasn't as overpowered as it is here. Fighting at random encounters also had a lot more complexity to them now. If you knocked down the leader of the fight, all the enemies would get scared, and if they were attacked, they would die in one hit, no matter how much health they have. Enemies could also run away from battle, or even worse, call in reinforcements. The reinforcements wouldn't have been as big of a problem if it weren't for the high encounter rates in Yakuza 5, especially for Kiryu and Saejima's cities. Their cities were essentially just a bunch of hallways, making it really hard to avoid the encounters. In other Yakuza games, when you finish a fight, the enemies that were next to you would often despawn, but not in Yakuza 5 though. You could literally finish a fight, forget that an enemy was next to you, take 2 steps, and then you're in another fight. It can get very tiring. Weapons were also given experience levels, which you'd level up by using said weapons. By leveling up your weapons, you would also get benefits like better durability and higher attack power. And the higher your level, the more powerful weapons you could also use. With this being the biggest Yakuza game, the story is also one of the longest. The story structure is the same as in 4, where you would follow a character's story from start to finish, with all of them coming together towards the end of the game. The story has its fair share of controversies, with a lot of people saying that it's one of the worst in the franchise, and while I don't think it's the worst plot, I'm personally disappointed with 2 characters specifically. I won't say the name for the first one because they end up being the final boss, but why are they the final boss? They didn't really feel important throughout the story, and then suddenly they make a comeback in the finale and it's revealed that they're the son of an Omi Alliance chairman. It just felt very cheap and too convenient. The second character with missed potential is Mirai Park. Without getting into her personality in general, because that's just an entirely different kind of worms, they were building her up to be some sort of important character at the beginning of Haruka's story, only for them to eat her off. Most of the stuff we learned about her isn't from her, but it's just simply told about them from other characters. And the way that they portray her when she's alive is what makes me really sad, only showing her as a cold and selfish person who is harsh and physically abusive to her employees. I found it really hard to feel sorry for her. But overall though, this game is peak Yakuza, including the main menu. Kiryu is wearing his coat while slowly walking away from Kamurocho's gate. I can imagine Kiryu trying to leave his past behind, only for it to chase him down again. The main menu soundtrack also bangs, easily an A tier. I was going to start Yakuza 6 on this day of the challenge as well, but I forgot to actually download the game, and with it being already so late and my slow internet download speed, I decided just to leave it for the next day. There is a large shift between Yakuza 5 and 6. Instead of having multiple playable characters, you can only play as Kiryu here. In fact, none of the playable characters apart from Akiyama even make an appearance in the game. But even then, he doesn't really get that much screen time. The game is very self-contained, introducing new characters, enemies, and even a brand new playable area that's only available in Yakuza 6 to this day. You wouldn't have to play any of the other games to understand this plot. Yakuza 6's combat felt very primitive compared to the other Yakuza games. I've seen many people complain about the heat orbs, but the heat system still acts the same way as it did before, just that it's orbs instead of a bar now. I will say though that unlocking extra heat orbs is a pain, with it taking tons of experience points without it really being too useful. Like, you only really need one heat orb just to beat the game really. Yakuza 6 has cut out a lot of heat actions as well. To activate most of them, you have to go into extreme heat mode. Your limited heat action moveset will be even more limited. So limited in fact, that you don't even have a heat action available to you when an enemy is laying on the floor. The combat was also slower compared to other games, which I don't really mind, but what I do mind is that when enemies block your attacks, Kiryu staggers a little bit and slows down more than usual. Also, Kiryu isn't able to carry any weapons in his inventory. He is only able to pick up weapons or objects in the area where you start to fight, so you will most likely be limited to bikes and signs. Some enemies do carry guns and knives though, but they can be rare to find outside of the main story. The reworked experience system is also a bit unbalanced, so you essentially have 5 different stats that you get experience for, and you can use a certain stat or a combination of stats to upgrade your abilities or general upgrades like health extensions, attack power, agility, and defense. It's definitely different and more unique approach to experience points, which is something that I can always appreciate. But they give you little to zero green and purple orbs, and you end up in a weird dynamic where you have 9,999 blue, orange, and red orbs, but 0 purple and green orbs. With all that being said though, this is one of my favorite games in the franchise because of its story. With this being Kiryu's quote-unquote final adventure, you'd think that there would be a lot of references to previous games, but as I mentioned, it's more of a standalone title. After the events of Yakuza 5, Kiryu goes back to the joint. After serving his sentence, he finds out that Haruka has gone missing, finding out that she was hit by a car and is now in a coma. And not only that, she also has a baby with her. Child Protection Services want to take the baby away, and Kiryu won't allow it, so he commits a crime by kidnapping the child and is now on a journey to find the father, leading him to the new playable area, a small town by the seaside called Onimichi. And well, because it's Kiryu, he gets into trouble with the Yomi Alliance, the local Yakuza clan, to prevent Kiryu from finding out the sound's secrets, among other things. This game was also fully voice acted, including all of the sub-stories. With this apparently being Kiryu's final game, I can understand what they would put in the money to have this game fully dubbed. But personally, I would rather have that money spent on hiring more developers, or having the game be worked on for a few more months just to make the combat feel better. I would skip out on most of the dialogue anyway, since I would just read the subtitles. The main menu is also a bit bland this time around. It's just a black background with some blurred lights, with a close-up of Kiryu's mean mug on the right side. The soundtrack for the menu is nice to listen to, so I'll put it in B tier. The latest entry in the mainline games is a soft reset for the franchise, with it not only introducing a new protagonist, but also departing from the traditional beat-em-up gameplay, favoring turn-based combat instead. This game follows a new protagonist, Kasuga Ichiban, a loyal but low-ranking Yakuza member that is loyal to his third-rate family. So loyal in fact that he spent 18 years in the joint for a crime that he didn't even commit. After his sentence, he tries to find his former boss, and he does, only for Ichiban to get shot by him, and brought away from Kamurocho and into a new city, Izazaki Ijincho. Still loyal to his boss though, Ichi believes that there is something more to it, and he tries to find the truth. Unlike Kiryu though, Ichiban isn't alone. He meets many characters and friends throughout the game that help him find the truth. Outside of the combat, the games are pretty much the same, similar sub-stories, minigames, and world travel. This is the first game where you can actually call a taxi from any part of the map, which is a really nice quality of life update. The combat itself has changed a lot though. As I previously mentioned, this is now a turn-based RPG where you can control Ichiban and his party. Each members have different classes, or as the game likes to call them, jobs, which determine what kind of abilities they have. Things like heals, magic, tanks, etc. You can also change a character's job by going to a place called Hello Work to find new employment. This was the longest game for me to complete in this challenge, clocking in at just over 10 hours. Yes, even longer than Yakuza 5, although by not too much. But it wasn't necessarily because of how long the gameplay was, but because I actually rewatched most of the cutscenes. This was the first Yakuza game I've played, and revisiting it for the first time in 2.5 years, I've been able to appreciate this game much more after playing all the other Yakuza games. Kiryu and Ichiban feel like polar opposites, and this even shows by the suits that these two wear, having the same two colors but inverted. While Kiryu has always been a straight-faced stoic who was often by himself throughout his journeys, Ichi is a lovable man who participates in occasional tomfoolery with his friends, and he's so obsessed with video games like Dragon Quest to the point that he sees street fights as turn-based battles. And yes, that's the canonical reason for the genre switch. This is RGG Studios' first RPG genre game, and you can tell. The combat and classes aren't too balanced, especially when it comes to the mana points when using special moves. There were many instances where I was using the cheapest moves in the late game because they did tons of damage. Moves like Head Trauma or Ichiban's Tenacious Fist, just to name a few. But these are just minor complaints. This game is really good. The main menu takes after Kiwami 2 and 6 with a black background. You can see Ichiban walking towards something with a spike club on his hand and his dragonfish tattoo on full display. I guess I'll put it in C tier. The latest game in the franchise, Like a Dragon Ishin, is a remastered version of the Yakuza Ishin games. This game isn't canon in terms of story. I like to see this game as if it were a play, with each character's personality roughly matching the role they are playing as. The characters in this game's story are based on real historical figures, such as Sakamoto Ryoma and Saito Hajime. Despite them being household names in Japan, not much is known about them at all, which gives the story writers a lot more freedom. The way I like to see it is that the story is an interpretation or an exciting what-if scenario, rather than a completely accurate historical retelling of this period, and this game is much better for it. Thankfully, I did a challenge run for this game about 2 months ago, so I knew where to go for the most part. I also didn't have to exclusively use the brawler fighting mode, which made this game a lot easier as well. And speaking of fighting stances, the original Ishin was the first game to bring multiple fighting stances into the franchise. You had the Brawler, Swordsman, Gunman, and Wild Dancer classes, with the Wild Dancer being a combination of the Gunman and Swordsman fighting style. Each fighting stance also had their own skill tree that you could level up, giving you different abilities for each class, making them a bit more unique than just weapon classes. There's also a blacksmith as well, where you can craft stronger weapons to equip, although the blacksmith felt kind of useless, even during my very first playthrough outside of this challenge, because the game just gives you new and actually useful weapons each time you complete a chapter. One of the biggest controversies surrounding this game is the card system. You can collect cards throughout the game and build decks, which you can then equip on one of your fighting styles. Each card has different abilities, ranging from healing you, boosting attacks slightly, to slowing down the space-time continuum or summoning a black hole to suck all the enemies in. With Ishin being one of the more grounded games in the Yakuza franchise, many people were annoyed with these abilities being in the game, and with them breaking the immersion. Personally though, I didn't really mind these cards too much, and in fact, they made the game feel a lot more replayable for me, especially when going for 100% save file for this game. Having different abilities and moves made the game more interesting when grinding out for items and for blacksmith completion. But I guess that'd be for another video. What I will say though is that the UI for the card display looks really bad though. It just takes up way too much of the screen, and they decided to put it in the bottom left, moving the minimap from its usual space, which definitely doesn't make things confusing at all. In my experience, the game's performance got worse with the updates. I didn't have as much pop-in when the game first came out. It would only happen when loading the area once for the first time, and then it wouldn't happen again. But for the newer versions, the pop-in has become much more noticeable, and the stuttering when doing heat actions made the game feel a lot less fun. I haven't played a lot of the original Ishin, but from what I can tell, LED Ishin in itself is a great game, but just not a good remaster. The main menu isn't anything crazy either, it's just a backdrop of a tower. C tier. Judgment. At one point this was my favorite Yakuza game, until I played Lost Judgment. RGG Studios considered this as a different franchise from Yakuza, introducing a whole new set of characters and a story self-contained to the Judgment franchise only. With that being said though, they are still part of the same universe, and the locations of the games are also the same. In Judgment, you only have access to Kamurocho, as since you're playing as a detective, you get to see the city in a different way, whether it be through a drone, or if you're on a tailing mission. Yakami is also a bit of a lockpicker, being able to get through locked doors and safes, with 2 minigames to go along with them. And the first one you have to move your joysticks the same way the game shows you to, and if you mess up you have to restart from the beginning. And the second one, which I prefer, you have to find the sweet spot for the switches. They're quite generous with the time though, so there isn't really any pressure when doing them. But let's talk about what actually matters here, the combat. Yakami has 2 fighting styles, Crane, which is intended to be used against multiple enemies, and Tiger, which is used for one-on-one combat. While both fighting styles are good, the Tiger fighting style is clearly the better one, thanks to some of the abilities you can unlock. Yakami is also a lot more acrobatic and flexible compared to Kiryu. He is able to jump over enemies and wall jump for extra damage too, which is incredibly fun to do. He's also able to use acrobatics outside of combat as well, being able to do things like climbing buildings and doing parkour. The ability unlock system reminds me of Yakuza 4, where you can choose which abilities to upgrade at any point, as long as you have enough special points, or SP for them. You can get SP from fighting obviously, but in general it's also given to you for completing sub-stories and completing stuff from the completion list. Yagami is a former lawyer turned detective that was given a job to investigate a case of serial murders, where each of the victims' eyes were gouged out. As Yagami delves deeper into this case, he starts to realize that the murders have linked to one of his trials in court, specifically the court that forced him to retire. As he gets closer to the truth, his life is put in great danger, but with his strong sense of justice, he just keeps pushing for the truth. This is one of the best games that RGG Studios have ever put out, and as I mentioned earlier, this was one of my favorite games in general. I've even made a video talking about the completionist experience for it, but when replaying through this game for this challenge, I started to notice a few cracks with it. This game has a bit of Yakuza 1 syndrome, where a good chunk of the game just kind of forces you into doing side stories, or side cases as they're called in this game, just to pad out the game's length. If it were only 1 or 2 extra side cases for the whole game, I wouldn't mind it too much, especially because some of them explain certain gameplay elements. But if that were the case, then I wouldn't really be talking about it here. This game has a lot of idle time in general. There are many moments in the story where the game tells you to wait for a call, or to wait for somebody to meet up with you, where you actually have to physically wait for 3 minutes. Now, Yakuza 0 had something similar with the business minigame, for example, and there were even 2 parts of the story where you had to wait as well. But you can actually speed those up by playing games in the arcade. With that being said though, it wasn't really that much of the playthrough, but with this being one of the longer games, just cracking above 7 hours, the extra half an hour or so of idle time would have been nice to cut out. Despite me complaining about this game, I still think that this game is one of the best. If you've never played any of the Yakuza games before and you didn't want to play the older games, then this game will be my go-to recommendation for you. And don't even get me started on the main menu. Putting the red and yellow colors aside for now, Yagami is separating the background, with it being white on the left and black on the right, and it just shows how Yagami is blurring the line between what is right and wrong, showing his dilemma from the story. I have no idea what the red, yellow, and blue lines could mean, but it just looks cool. A tier. With the last day upon me, I only had one final game left to complete, and that would be the sequel to Judgment, Lost Judgment. A few of Yagami's friends open up a detective agency in Izanagi Ijincho, the same place where Yakuza 7, or Like a Dragon takes place, and they ask Yagami for his guidance to help them set up properly. While there, Yagami gets a job where he has to investigate bullying inside of a high school, and then blah blah blah, something about violent murder, government conspiracies, and Yagami's strong sense of justice making him prevail through all the dangers he's facing. A lot of the story plot points are the same as in the first game, except that there are high school students involved now, and that it takes place in a different city for the most part. The gameplay is mostly the same as well, with a few balancing changes made to the fighting styles, though the Tiger style is still the best out of the 3. And yes, a new fighting style called Snake was added. It's a combination of the Tiger and Crane fighting stances, with a heavy emphasis on parrying and de-weaponizing enemies. I rarely used it during my playthrough though. If you have the remastered version or bought the DLC, a 4th fighting style is given to you called the Boxer, but the only way to upgrade its abilities is to beat the Boxing School Club minigame, so I've ignored it for the most part, even in my casual file, which I'm going for 100% for. In addition to the tailing sections from the last game, stealth sections are also a thing now, where you have to sneak around buildings without being detected by the enemy, because if you do, then it results in a game over. Another new addition is the Mystery School Club, which gives an excuse for Yagami to join a bunch of other school clubs, with each of them having their own little storylines and exclusive minigames. Like the boxing matches I've mentioned before, dance lessons, skateboarding, and the robotics club, just to name a few. Most of the game's side content takes place here, and thankfully none of it is required to do for a casual playthrough. A thing that I really like about this game is that they removed the wait for phone call segments. Instead of waiting for 3 minutes, you can just walk out of the map zone you're in, and you'll be able to move on to the next part of the story, saving you lots of time. Overall, this game is just more Judgment, and I'm all here for it. The starting menu is something out of this world. You have Yagami and a cat standing out in the rain, and when you go to play the game or change the settings, it either pans to Yagami or the cat, depending on which option you're choosing. There's also a small Easter egg where you can make Yagami light up a cigarette. RGG have outdone themselves with this game and this menu. S tier. But wait, there's still one more game to play. A few years after Lost Judgment came out, RGG Studios have released a small DLC package called the Kaito Files, a small story where Kaito, Yagami's partner in crime, is left out to solve a case on his own. A case which involves his former love who has gone missing. I decided to bring back the speedrun timer for this game because I actually did a few speedruns of this game before. I also decided to play this game at the last possible moment, giving myself just a little bit over an hour to complete this game before hitting the deadline. Kaito has 2 fighting styles, Bruiser and Tank, which are just Kiryu's Brawler and Beast fighting stances respectively, and oh my goodness, this game plays so well. I hope that the combat in Gaiden will feel similar to this. The DLC package just proves that Kiryu does in fact belong on the Dragon engine. The Kaito File doesn't have that much side content. Most of the minigames in Lost Judgment were cut out from here, and you don't have access to Ijincho. But like, if you just want to do that, then you can play the base game. So I personally don't have any issues with it. And there we go. The challenge has been successfully completed. I beat every Yakuza game that's available on Steam within 1 week, with only a few minutes to spare before reaching the deadline. Although it was quite stressful for games like Kiwami and Judgment, this challenge was actually a lot of fun to do, and I'm happy that I did it. If I ever have as much free time as I did now, it would be cool to do this with all 19 of the games next time, but that would require months of prep time and learning full speedrun routes for a few of the games. I did mention a few times during the video, but I did use NG files for some of the runs. While it makes sense for games like Kiwami to use it, and for Yakuza 5 and Lost Judgment for my Legend difficulty achievement playthroughs, it did take away a bit of the challenge. Please let me know what you thought about this video, and what do you think of the Yakuza games in general. I'd love to have a discussion. Thanks for watching, cheers.